The September sun hammered down on Crescent Hill Drive like judgment, turning the asphalt into a minor mirage that shimmered between the manicured lawns and gleaming mailboxes. The neighborhood was exactly the kind of place where people paid $500,000 for the address alone, where established in 1998 meant legacy, where every hedge was trimmed by professionals, and where the social hierarchy was as rigid as the HOA bylaws. Marcus Chen stood at the bottom of the street, skateboard tucked under one arm, his college acceptance letter crumpled in his back pocket. The letter was from UCLA, full-ride engineering scholarship. His mom had cried. His younger sister had screamed. His father, before the stroke that took most of his words and all of his left side's mobility, had squeezed Marcus's shoulder hard enough to hurt in the best way possible. But his father couldn't make the drive up to Crescent Hill anymore. That's why Marcus had come alone, 3 weeks after the acceptance letter arrived, seeking the one thing no scholarship could give him: proof. "Can I help you?" The voice came from behind him, sharp, crystalline, carrying the particular timbre of someone used to being answered immediately. Marcus turned to find a girl emerging from the house directly behind him. She was perhaps 16, with the kind of casual beauty that came from never having to try. Blonde hair that fell exactly where it wanted to, expensive sunglasses pushed into her hairline, wearing what looked like athleisure clothing that probably cost more than Marcus's monthly Metro card. "I'm looking for something," Marcus said carefully. "The bus stop is 3 blocks down," she smiled without warmth. "Though I'm not sure it comes through here anymore, they rerouted it." Marcus felt the familiar hot flush start in his chest, the one that came with every casual dismissal, every assumption, every time someone looked at him and saw problem instead of person. But he kept his voice level. "I'm looking for the Martinez property, 2-story colonial built in, late 2000s, has a pool in the back." The girl's expression shifted infinitesimally, a tightening at the corners of her mouth. "That's my house." "Can I see the pool?" "Absolutely not." The refusal was so immediate, so visceral, that Marcus took an actual step back. The girl moved forward, her body language suddenly aggressive in a way that her casual slouch hadn't suggested. She wore her entitlement like armor. "I don't know what you're selling or what you're casing, but this is private property. Parents," she called out, not breaking eye contact with Marcus. "Parents, there's someone here." "Wait," Marcus started, but the girl was already moving toward her front door, and the damage was already done. He could hear the shuffle of feet inside the house, could sense the machinery of alarm and protocol clicking into place. He turned and walked back down the street, his heart hammering against his ribs. Behind him, he heard the girl say something to her parents, something about some guy asking about the pool, probably casing the neighborhood, and could they please look into the security system. By the time he reached the corner, Marcus could already hear the discussion about calling the police, and he walked faster. He didn't get far. The girl, he learned her name was Shelby when she shouted it to her father, caught up with him at the end of the block in a pearl-white Range Rover that seemed to glide rather than drive. The window rolled down with mechanical precision. "Dad wants to know what you want," Shelby said flatly. Behind her, barely visible, was a man in his 60s wearing polo and a scowl. Marcus's mind raced. Part of him, the smart part, the part that listened to his mother and went to the library and had just gotten into UCLA, wanted to walk away. There was nothing to gain here. The other part, the part that had grown in the absence of his father's stories, needed to know. "My father built that pool," Marcus said quietly. The silence that followed was profound. Even the autumn wind seemed to stop. Shelby's father leaned over from the driver's seat, studying Marcus with the intensity of someone trying to determine if he was threatening or simply insane. "Is that so?" the man said. It wasn't a question. 20 years ago, he was a contractor. Marcus Chen SR, he has the documentation, the permits, the blueprints, photographs. "We purchased this house in 2006, the father said. "From the Richardsons, the pool was already constructed. It's a beautiful pool, regulation size, cost us a fortune to maintain, actually." "My father built it in 2004, Marcus said, and he could hear his own desperation in his voice, could feel how young and powerless it made him sound. "He built it for the original owners, the Richardson family. They must have hired him." Shelby was watching him with something new in her expression, not quite sympathy, but something closer to interest now. Her father, however, had already closed that window back up. The Range Rover was moving before Marcus finished speaking. Shelby's face receding behind tinted glass. He stood in the middle of the street as the SUV pulled into the driveway, as the garage door opened like a mouth, as the vehicle slid inside and the door closed behind it. The pool was invisible from the street. There was a fence, high and private and absolute, but Marcus could imagine it. Could imagine his father, 20 years younger, building it brick by brick, tile by tile, creating something permanent in this neighborhood of transient wealth. He wanted to go home. Instead, he turned around and went to the public library. The research took 3 hours. He was good at research. It was part of why he'd gotten the scholarship, but the trail was deliberately obscured. The house had changed hands multiple times. Property records existed, but they weren't set up to tell the story he needed. What he found were tax assessments and mortgage transfers, but nothing that definitively connected his father to this specific pool at this specific address. What he did find, buried in the archives of the local newspaper's digitized back issues, was an article from 2004. Local contractor WINS Design Award. The photo was small and pixelated, but he'd recognize his father anywhere. Marcus Chen SR, designer and builder of the Crescent Hill Residence's custom pool system. The article was 2 paragraphs long and mentioned that the pool incorporated sustainable water recirculation technology and local stone, and that young Marcus Chen SR was bidding for more projects in the area. There was no indication that he ever got those projects. Marcus printed the article and held it in his trembling hands for a long time before he left the library. His phone buzzed, his mother wondering where he was. She had a shift at the hospital starting at 3. Could he pick up his sister from school? Could he help his father with his exercises? He was supposed to. He was always supposed to. But instead, he drove back up to Crescent Hill Drive, parked his second-hand Civic 3 blocks away, and stood outside the Martinez house until dusk began to paint the sky purple and orange. He stood there until the automatic lights came on in the backyard, until he could see the glow of the pool reflecting against the fence, until he was sure, absolutely certain, that his father's work was still here, still maintaining its purpose, still serving people who would never know his name. He stood there until the anger crystallized into something harder and colder, and much more dangerous than anything he'd felt before. Then he walked home to his father's silence, and his mother's exhaustion, and his sister's endless questions about what UCLA was like, trying to smile, trying to pretend that the ground hadn't just shifted beneath him. The next morning, Marcus went back to the library. He began to research every project his father had ever completed in this area. He spent hours cross-referencing addresses and dates and names. He called his father's old foreman and pretended to be gathering information for a school project. He checked construction databases and property records and anything else he could find. By the end of the week, he had 17 addresses. 17 pools, water features, and hardscape projects that his father had built in this neighborhood. 17 properties where his father's permanent work lived on without acknowledgement. And he had the Martinez address circled in red. He didn't know what he was going to do with this information yet. He only knew that the injustice of it, the erasure, the casual dismissal, the way his father's brilliant work had been absorbed into other people's identity, was eating him alive. His mother noticed. His sister noticed. Even his father, through the fog of his stroke-addled brain, seemed to sense that something had shifted in his son. On Saturday morning, Marcus did something he'd never done before. He asked his father about the pool. His father's words came slow and slurred, each one an effort, but they came. "Your pool," he said, and Marcus had to play the words back in his mind several times to understand. Future, built for you." "Dad, what do you mean?" But his father had exhausted himself with the effort. He pointed instead, with his good hand, at an old photograph on his bedside table. Marcus and his father, when Marcus was 6 years old, both standing in front of a construction site. His father was pointing at the hole in the ground where something would become a pool. He was smiling like he'd just changed the world. Marcus carefully lifted the photo and carried it out of the room. In the light of the hallway, he could see the pride in his father's face. The clear, unambiguous joy of someone who had built something beautiful and knew it mattered. That's when Marcus decided. He didn't decide to do anything illegal. He didn't decide to steal or vandalize or harm. Instead, he decided on something far more complex. He decided to become unforgettable. He decided that if the neighborhood of Crescent Hill wanted to erase his father's legacy, he would make sure they couldn't ignore it. He would make them acknowledge it. He would make them see. He started small. He became a fixture in the neighborhood, always with a notebook, always taking pictures of the properties his father had built. He began leaving anonymous packages on doorsteps, photocopies of his father's original blueprints, articles about sustainable pool design, educational materials about the history of construction in the area. Some residents called the police. Others simply left the packages in their trash. Shelby's house received the most attention. Marcus visited 17 times in 2 weeks, leaving increasingly detailed documentation of the pool's construction, the history of its building, the extraordinary engineering his father had incorporated into what everyone else saw as simply an addition to their home's value. None of it was threatening. All of it was calculated to create pressure, to create awareness, to create discomfort. By the 4th week of October, the Martinez household had become impossible to ignore. Shelby's parents began asking questions. They ordered a property inspection. They contacted the previous homeowners. They slowly, reluctantly began to believe that, yes, someone named Marcus Chen had indeed constructed their pool, and yes, there appeared to be someone who believed this fact was worth publicizing. That's when Shelby confronted him. She did it at the parking lot of the farmer's market, where Marcus's mother sometimes worked weekends. Marcus was helping her load containers of prepared food when Shelby approached with the certainty of someone who had never been told no. "Stop leaving things at my house," she said flatly. Marcus turned to look at her. In the sunlight, without her house surrounding her like armor, Shelby looked younger, vulnerable, still armored, but the cracks were showing. "Your father built your pool," Marcus said. "That's a fact. My parents paid for it. They own it. It's their pool now." "Ownership doesn't erase creation," Marcus said. And then, because he was young and angry and something in her face suggested she might actually listen. "My father had a stroke. His left side is paralyzed. He's in his 50s and he'll probably never work again, and he built 17 beautiful things in your neighborhood that no one acknowledges, that don't have his name on them, that have become part of everyone else's identity while he's been erased." He watched the information settle on Shelby's face. She looked genuinely uncomfortable. "That's not my fault," she said, but it came out like a question. "I didn't say it was. I'm just saying it's true." Marcus's mother called him over to help with another load. When he looked back, Shelby was gone. He thought that was the end of it. He thought she'd learned her lesson, or not, and they'd move on with their lives in their respective positions in the hierarchy. But 3 days later, his phone rang. Unknown number. He almost didn't answer. "Is this Marcus?" The voice was female, older, careful. "This is Janet Martinez, Shelby's mother. I'd like to talk to you about your father's pool." The Martinez living room was approximately twice the size of Marcus's entire house. He sat on a cream-colored sofa that probably had a thread count higher than his GPA, holding a cup of coffee that cost more than a Happy Meal, while Shelby's parents waited for him to speak. He didn't know why they'd invited him. He'd expected legal consequences, or at minimum a very strongly worded conversation about harassment and trespassing. Instead, Janet Martinez had been almost apologetic on the phone, and her husband, David, he'd learned, not the intimidating father from the SUV incident, seemed genuinely interested in what Marcus had to say. "Your mother spoke very highly of your father," Janet said. She was attractive in that particular way wealthy women of a certain age became, through careful maintenance and expert styling. "She's the nurse at Memorial, isn't she? I think I've seen her in the ICU where my sister was staying last year." Marcus nodded warily. His mother had mentioned a kind woman who'd asked about her family while delivering meds. He hadn't known that woman lived on Crescent Hill. "The reason we called you," David said, leaning forward with the body language of someone used to closing deals, "is that your information has raised some concerns for us. Specifically, we've verified that yes, Marcus Chen SR did indeed construct our pool. We've actually found his original contract, filed with the property records from the Richardson sale in 2006. Marcus's heart stuttered. "You have." "Your father didn't register the project properly," David continued, and for the first time, Marcus heard something like sympathy in his voice. "According to the paperwork, he was owed an additional inspection certification. Without it, the renovation, which included significant structural work, we've learned, never properly transferred into the property records, which means for the last 20 years, our insurance company has been undervaluing this asset." "Which means," he paused, And even this close to the prize, Marcus could see the man's lawyer brain calculating angles. That we might have grounds for a claim against the original contractors, or the original owners, or both. "I don't understand," Marcus said slowly. Janet set down her coffee cup with deliberation. "Your father did beautiful work. Our pool specialists have confirmed that the engineering is actually extraordinary. The water recirculation system, the sustainable filtration. This was not standard work. This was bespoke, high-end, exactly the kind of thing that would increase property value significantly if it was properly documented." "Why are you telling me this?" "Because," David said, and now there was definitely a shark in his smile, "we want to talk to your father. We want to understand exactly what was built here, what the original specifications were, and whether there are any issues with the execution that we should know about. And we're prepared to pay for his time and expertise. We're also prepared to help him formalize his documentation of this project in a way that might benefit him going forward." Shelby appeared in the doorway then, carrying her own cup of coffee. She was still in her pajamas at 3 in the afternoon, the privilege of a Saturday morning allowed to turn into afternoon. She avoided looking at Marcus directly. "Mom, I told Marcus something the other day that wasn't fair," she said quietly. "I said he didn't belong in the neighborhood, but his father actually built something important here. I've been thinking about that." Janet smiled at her daughter with visible pride. David nodded slowly, and Marcus realized they'd orchestrated this, the careful family moment, the acknowledgement, the path to resolution. What he didn't realize was that this was the moment everything stopped being about his father at all. "I'd like to offer you something," David said, and he pulled out a piece of paper. It was a check already made out, $50,000. "This is to cover your father's consultation, his time, his expertise, and to compensate him for the documentation he lost when the project wasn't properly registered. It's a partial settlement, informal, nothing legal, but it's a start." Marcus stared at the check. His family could live on $50,000 for a year. His mother could quit one of her 3 jobs. His father could get better physical therapy, could afford the things insurance wouldn't cover. His sister could get braces without his mother working double shifts. He reached for it, then stopped. "Why?" he asked. "Because it's the right thing to do," Janet said simply. But then when David pulled the check back slightly, she amended. "And because Shelby suggested it. And because when I looked up the Richardson sale from 2006, I learned something interesting. The original owner, James Richardson, died 5 years ago. His daughter is a colleague of my husband's. When David called her yesterday to verify the pool's construction, she said her father always regretted not acknowledging the contractor properly. He'd wanted to recommend him to friends, but your father's business seemed to have disappeared. He couldn't rebuild," Marcus found himself saying. "After the stroke, he didn't have the resources, the rehab was expensive, it wiped out most of our savings." "Yes," David agreed quietly, "which is exactly why 50,000 is just a start." The second offer came 3 weeks later, this time from the Richardsons' daughter. She was interested in hearing Marcus Sr. to consult on an expansion of her own property, a different home in a different neighborhood, but she wanted his expertise. She'd asked for 3 weeks of his time over the next 4 months, at a rate that seemed to be triple what he would have charged 20 years ago. The third offer came from another family whose property Marcus had documented, and then another. Within 6 weeks, Marcus Sr. had consulting work lined up through the end of the year. But something had shifted in Marcus that no amount of money could quite fix. He should have been happy. His mother should have been happy. His father should have been happy, though the stroke made happiness difficult to read on his face. The acceptance to UCLA was confirmed. His future was secure. But there was a feeling growing in him, a dark, uncomfortable feeling that had nothing to do with gratitude and everything to do with the mechanics of how this had actually happened. The Martinezes hadn't contacted his father out of goodness. They'd done it because there was profit in it, because they'd discovered that the pool, his father's pool, had been undervalued in their property assessment and they could potentially use that for a tax claim. Because Shelby had felt pressured by Marcus's campaign of carefully deployed information. Because once the cost-benefit analysis was done, it had simply made sense to integrate Marcus Sr. into their narrative. The pool was still his father's creation, but now it was also the Martinez family's origin story, the magnanimous, wealthy people who discovered injustice and corrected it, who'd given the struggling contractor a second chance. They'd taken his work and folded it into their own identity. They'd appropriated the narrative, and everyone was letting them. Shelby started appearing at Marcus's gym. She'd never been to the gym before. This fact he knew because he'd been researching her extensively, learning her schedule, her habits, her vulnerabilities. She was careful about her fitness, attending 3 times a week at exactly 4 p.m., when the gym was crowded enough to make a serious workout difficult, but she could still be seen being there. She'd see Marcus and wave or say hello or sometimes sit near him on the cardio machines. It was friendly. It was measured. It was very clearly her parents' idea. "Your father seems really nice," she said one day, standing next to his treadmill in what appeared to be a coincidence but almost certainly wasn't. "I met him when my parents took us to his house for a consultation. He showed me pictures of all the pools he built. The work is incredible." Marcus didn't slow his pace. "Why are you talking to me?" "Because my parents said I should apologize," Shelby said, her voice small and sincere in that particular way that rich girls learn to be sincere. "For the things I said, I was judgmental. I made assumptions. I'm not that person anymore." "Yes, you are," Marcus said flatly. He was running fast now, pushing himself into the red zone. "That's exactly who you are. You're just performing someone better now because you've been hired to, because the narrative changed. You're still the girl who told me I didn't belong. You just realized there was profit in pretending I do." Shelby's face flushed. She looked genuinely hurt, which made it worse somehow. "That's not fair." "Fair?" Marcus laughed, and even to his own ears it sounded jagged and unhinged. "You want to talk about fair? Fair would be if my father hadn't had to wait 20 years for acknowledgement. Fair would be if one of the 17 families who profited from his work had ever learned his name. Fair would be if you didn't get to perform redemption because your parents found a tax angle." He grabbed his towel and walked away, leaving her standing there in her expensive athletic wear, with her perfect blonde hair and her complicated confusion, and it felt good. It felt like power. It felt like nothing, actually. It felt empty. 3 months in, Marcus stopped going to UCLA's prospective student events. He stopped responding to emails from his academic advisor. He told his mother he'd changed his mind about engineering and thought he might take a gap year instead. His mother, terrified, asked him to talk to his counselor. His counselor, a well-meaning woman named Ms. Reynolds, listened carefully to his explanation about wanting to focus on family and reevaluating his priorities, and suggested he was suffering from a form of depression that often affected high-achieving students in the aftermath of major transitions. She wasn't entirely wrong, but she wasn't entirely right either. The truth was something more complicated. Marcus had discovered something about himself during the process of making the neighborhood acknowledge his father. He had a gift for pressure. He had a talent for identifying what people valued, what they feared losing, and creating just enough discomfort to force them to act in his preferred direction. It was, he was beginning to realize, a remarkable skill. The kind of skill that could be weaponized in any number of directions. The kind of skill that was now pointing at Shelby specifically, though he hadn't quite admitted it to himself yet. She tried once more to connect with him, and this time he decided to let her. She'd been researching UCLA's engineering program, or claimed she had, and she wanted his advice on whether she should apply. They met at a coffee shop, neutral territory, and she ordered him a drink she still somehow remembered he'd preferred from a conversation they'd had weeks earlier. "I'm sorry," she said again. "I know I keep saying that, but I mean it. You were right about everything. I was shallow and judgmental, and I made assumptions based on where you were from and what you looked like. I'm genuinely sorry." Marcus studied her across the cafe table. She was very pretty in the way that was almost algorithmic. Blonde hair the exact shade that Instagram influencers aspired to, skin that had been treated with expensive serums, clothes that fit in a way that suggested they'd been tailored. But underneath all of that, there was something he almost recognized. Something that looked like genuine discomfort with herself. "Why should I believe you?" he asked. "You don't have to," Shelby said quietly. "But I'm going to UCLA too if I get in. I'm applying to the business school. I have to do community service for an ethics class I'm struggling with, and I'm going to spend it helping at your father's physical therapy clinic, starting next month." Marcus felt something shift in his chest. It was anger primarily, but underneath that's something else. Something that might have been hope, or might have been the satisfaction of knowing he was about to get exactly what he wanted. "Okay," he said slowly. "I believe you." Yeah, Marcus said. "Maybe we should start over. Maybe you should come to my house, meet my family. See where I'm actually from instead of driving by Crescent Hill." "I'd like that," Shelby said, and she smiled. And Marcus found himself smiling back even as his mind was already 3 steps ahead, planning, calculating, measuring. He'd already decided what he wanted from Shelby Martinez. He just hadn't admitted it yet. Marcus's house was not on Crescent Hill. It was not in the neighborhood where property values increased consistently every quarter, where houses had names and heritage, where the idea of a mortgage was considered somewhat quaint. It was in a neighborhood where people worked 3 jobs, where the street parking was tight, where Christmas decorations sometimes stayed up into March because taking them down required energy that was needed for everything else. Shelby arrived at 6 p.m. on a Friday evening in December, and Marcus watched her car, a newer BMW, a gift for her 18th birthday, pull up to the curb with a kind of horrified precision, as if the vehicle itself was shocked to be parked in such a location. She emerged carefully, as if stepping into deeper water, and Marcus came out to meet her before she could change her mind. "Hey," he said, and he smiled at her. A real smile, the kind he'd been practicing in the mirror for weeks, and watched her shoulders relax slightly. "Hi," she said back. She was holding a bottle of wine that her parents had clearly provided, probably with extensive instructions about when it was appropriate to drink it. "I brought something." "That's nice, come on." The house smelled like his mother's cooking. She'd been preparing for this visit all week, even though Marcus told her she didn't need to. His sister had cleaned the common spaces obsessively, until Marcus's mother finally told her to stop and just relax. His father was sitting in his recliner, his good hand on the remote, looking as comfortable as he ever got these days. "Dad, this is Shelby," Marcus said. "Shelby, this is my father." His father's face rearranged itself into a smile. "Hello," he said carefully. Each word still took effort, but he was getting better. The physical therapy was working. Shelby took his hand gently. "It's so nice to meet you," she said, and Marcus was struck by how much she actually sounded like she meant it. "Your son told me about the pool you built for his family. Well, for the Richardsons originally, but I was lucky enough to inherit it." She laughed a little. "I still can't believe it took us this long to realize what incredible work you did." His father nodded slowly, considering her, and then he squeezed her hand, his grip stronger than most people realized it was. "Good girl," he said. During dinner, his mother's excellent adobo chicken, rice, and vegetables served on her best dishes. Shelby asked his family questions. She asked his sister about school. She asked his mother about nursing. She asked his father about his engineering background, and sat patiently while he explained, in his careful, slurred speech, how he'd learned the pool design business from an older contractor, how he'd studied physics and fluid dynamics on his own, how he'd always wanted to build something that would last. She asked Marcus to show her his UCLA acceptance letter, which he did, and she actually read it instead of just making congratulatory sounds. She asked him why he was considering taking a gap year. She asked if he was scared. "Of what?" Marcus said. "Leaving home, changing, growing up, all of it." Marcus didn't answer immediately. He was watching her face in the light of his small dining room, noticing how carefully she was listening, how much of her attention she was actually deploying. It was a good performance, if that's what it was. But there was something underneath the performance that seemed genuine. "I'm scared of becoming someone who forgets where they came from," Marcus said finally. Shelby nodded. "That's the right fear to have." After dinner, Marcus's sister and mother gave him a look that was probably supposed to seem casual, and then took Marcus SR to his room for his evening routine. His father was increasingly tired in the evenings, and the physical therapy always knocked him out. Marcus and Shelby were left alone in the living room. "Your family is really nice," Shelby said. She was sitting on the couch, and Marcus was sitting at a deliberate distance from her, close enough to be interested, far enough to be safe. "Your family has money," Marcus said. "There's a difference." "I know there is." Shelby pulled her knees up to her chest, a gesture that was almost childlike. "I've been thinking a lot about what you said, about how I've always assumed things about people. I don't think I'm the person I want to be yet, but I'm trying." "Why do you care what kind of person you are?" Marcus asked. The question came out sharper than he intended. "Because I'm going to wake up one day and I'm going to be someone's boss, or someone's mother, or someone's friend, and I don't want to hurt people the way I hurt you. I don't want to pass that on." Marcus felt something in him soften a degree. It was manipulative to notice that softening, to catalog it, to file it away as useful information. He noticed it anyway. "Do you want to see my room?" he asked. They went upstairs and Marcus showed her his research, still displayed on his wall like a mission statement or a manifesto. The 17 addresses, the photographs, the articles about his father, the documentation of work that had disappeared into other people's homes and lives. Shelby stood in front of the wall for a long time. "You did this to make me see," she said quietly. "This wasn't really about making the neighborhood acknowledge your father. This was about making me specifically understand what I'd done." Marcus didn't deny it. He was beginning to realize that Shelby was smarter than he'd given her credit for, smarter, potentially, than he was. The realization was uncomfortable. "Would you have listened if I just talked to you?" he asked. "No," Shelby said. "Probably not. I think I needed to be pushed into seeing it, so I guess. Thank you for not letting me stay ignorant." She turned to face him, and there was something in her expression, vulnerability mixed with respect, gratitude mixed with hurt. She was learning the cost of her former thoughtlessness, and she was choosing to learn anyway. That was worth something. "I'm sorry," Marcus said, and he was surprised to find he meant it, "for using you to prove my point." "I'm sorry for making your point necessary," Shelby replied. They stood there in Marcus's small room, surrounded by evidence of his methodical campaign to force her conscience into existence. And then, slowly, he moved toward her, and she moved toward him, and they met in the middle of the small space between what had been and what might become. It was not a romantic kiss, not at first. It was something more complicated, an exchange of vulnerability, a mutual acknowledgement of things changed and changing. And then it became something else, something warmer, and Marcus let it, because for the first time in months he wasn't performing anything. He was just a 17-year-old boy holding a girl in his small room, and it was enough. "I don't want to play games anymore," Shelby whispered against his neck. "I don't want to use you, I don't want to be used. Is that possible?" Marcus wanted to say yes. He wanted to believe that it was possible, that something real could exist between them after all of this. But there was still a part of him, maybe always would be, that was calculating angles, measuring leverage, thinking 3 steps ahead. He couldn't quite turn that part off, even for her. "I want it to be possible," he said instead. And he meant it. That was the strangest part, the most manipulative moment of his life so far, and he absolutely meant it. Over the next few weeks, they became inseparable. Shelby started her community service at the physical therapy clinic, and Marcus watched her work alongside his mother, holding his father's good arm as he practiced standing, encouraging him through exercises that clearly caused pain. She showed up even when Marcus wasn't there. She showed up on days when it would have been easier not to. She got into UCLA. When she called him with the news, she was crying. Happy tears, but also tears that held some complexity underneath them. "We're going to be at the same school," she said. "Isn't that crazy? What are the odds?" Marcus had already calculated the odds, actually. He knew that Shelby had had more than a decent shot at UCLA with her SAT scores and her family connections. He'd known this was coming, but he didn't tell her that. "It's perfect," he said instead. "It's fate." But it wasn't fate. It was the result of 2 people moving toward each other along a path that had been carefully constructed by one of them. Which was, he was beginning to understand, only slightly less random than actual chance. It was just more intentional, more devastating, more real. His mother pulled him aside in late January. "She's not going to fix you," his mother said quietly, while his father was sleeping and his sister was at a friend's house. "What?" "Shelby, she's not going to make you stop being angry. She's not going to make this better or fair or just." Marcus wanted to argue, but he found he couldn't. "I know," he said. "And she doesn't deserve to be the person who has to try," his mother continued. "She's a good girl. She made mistakes and she's correcting them. That's all she did. She didn't commit any actual sins against our family." "I know that too." "Then why are you still with her?" Marcus didn't have a good answer for that. Because he loved her. Because she was a living representation of the injustice he'd been trying to solve. Because she was useful and intelligent and increasingly becoming the only person he could actually talk to. Because he wanted to see if he could hurt her, just a little the way his family had been hurt, to confirm that pain was universal and not specific to people like them. "Because I do," he said finally. "I love her." His mother looked at him for a long moment, and her expression was so sad that he had to look away. "Then treat her like it," she said, "because I think you're still planning to break her heart, and I don't want to watch you do that to someone who doesn't deserve it." She left the room, and Marcus sat in the silence of his small house, with his sleeping father down the hall and his mother's words still vibrating in the air. He thought about all the things he'd planned without naming the plans as plans, all the ways he'd been measuring Shelby, calculating her, positioning her. And he thought about whether he actually could stop. The summer between high school and college, Shelby's parents threw a party. It was catered, obviously, and expensive, and held at the house on Crescent Hill. Everyone was there. Shelby's entire graduating class, a handful of their families, a few of David and Janet's business associates with their own teenagers in tow. The pool sparkled in the June heat, impossibly blue and perfectly maintained. Shelby had invited Marcus with considerable anxiety about how her parents would handle it, but David and Janet had been nothing but welcoming. David had even taken Marcus aside to offer him a job working at his law firm that summer, data research, entry-level stuff, but good money and good experience. Marcus had said yes. He was spending his last summer before UCLA working for Shelby's father, documenting his own. He saw the irony as clearly as anyone would. What he was less clear on was whether the irony was the point, or whether he was actually trying to prove something else, that he could compete in Shelby's world, that he wasn't trapped by his circumstances, that his father's limitations didn't define his own possibilities. Probably both, probably none of it, probably something more complicated that he didn't quite want to examine. The party was everything he'd expected it to be, beautiful, polished, and alienating in ways that wealth managed to obscure if you weren't paying close attention. People were kind to him, mostly. The parents were impressed by his UCLA acceptance. The kids, Shelby's friends, were curious about him the way people get curious about anthropological specimens, interesting to observe, but ultimately separate from their own reality. Shelby moved between worlds, bringing Marcus into conversations and then stepping back to let him navigate them. It was a performance, but it was a generous one. She was trying to integrate him. That mattered. Around sunset, when the party was at its peak and the atmosphere had shifted from nice family event to let's ignore our parents and have actual fun, Shelby pulled Marcus toward the pool. "Come on," she said. "You never actually get in the water when you're here." "I didn't bring a suit." "So everyone's splashing around in the pool at this point. Just roll up your pants." He followed her toward the edge, and they sat down, dangling their feet into water that his father had created. Marcus could feel it now, the engineering underneath the surface, the careful thought, the precision. The water temperature was perfect. The circulation was silent, professional, invisible. This was what his father had built. "I've been thinking about something," Shelby said, and her voice was careful. "About that first day when you came to my house." "Yeah. I want to know what would have happened if my parents hadn't called the police. If I'd just let you look at the pool, if you'd seen it and then gone home. Would you have done everything else anyway? The research, the documentation, the pressure campaign?" Marcus considered the question honestly. "I don't know, probably, but differently. You made it personal." "How?" "Because you dismissed me, and I needed to be not dismissed. I needed to matter." Shelby was quiet for a moment. Around them, her friends splashed and laughed, entirely unaware that they were witnessing something significant, or maybe aware and respectfully pretending not to pay attention. "You matter to me," Shelby said finally. "I need you to know that, not because I'm performing atonement, not because my parents set it up, because I actually think you're extraordinary, and I'm terrified that you're going to wake up one day and realize you've wasted your energy on me when you could have been doing actual important things." "Like what?" Marcus asked. "Like changing the system that erased your father, like building your own legacy, like becoming the person you're supposed to be instead of becoming the person who's trying to punish me for being born into money." Marcus pulled his feet out of the water. "I'm not trying to punish you." "Aren't you?" Shelby's voice was gentle but definite. "Because sometimes I feel it, the way you watch me, the way you're calculating, the way you're waiting for me to show that I'm still the shallow girl from the beginning so you can have proof that you were right about me all along." "You're not shallow." "I know," Shelby said, "and you know, and we're both sort of pretending that we don't because the story is easier if I stay bad and you stay wronged. But that's not fair to either of us." Marcus felt something crystallize in his chest. It was a moment of reckoning, and he could feel the weight of it. "I love you," he said. "I want you to know that. I'm also afraid that I'm a bad person in ways I don't fully understand yet. And I'm also aware that I might be using you to avoid looking at those things about myself. But I do love you." Shelby took his hand. "Then come to UCLA and don't be the person who's still angry at me for something I've already apologized for and tried to fix. Come to UCLA and be the person who got the scholarship because he's brilliant. Be the person whose father built beautiful things. Be the person who's going to build beautiful things. Don't waste your talent on guilt or on some idea of justice that never actually requires you to do anything except hurt people who are trying to help." "That's a lot to ask," Marcus said. "I know," Shelby replied, "but I'm asking anyway." He kissed her then, in front of her friends and her parents, and the pool his father had built. And for a moment he let himself believe that maybe, he could actually become someone better than the person he'd been trying to be. Then Shelby's father called everyone back to the house for cake, and the moment fractured like light on water. That night after the party ended and Marcus's mother picked him up, after he'd gone home and helped his father with his bedtime routine, he sat in his room and looked at his wall. At the research, at the evidence, at the documentation of an injustice that had slowly become something else as he'd been living through the vengeance. He began taking things down. Not all of it. He kept the photographs of his father's work. He kept the articles about sustainable pool design. He kept the copy of his father's original contract, but the red circles, the addresses, the methodology of pressure, all of it came down. His mother found him at 2 a.m., sitting on his floor surrounded by papers. "You're going to be okay," she said, sitting down beside him. "I was worried, but I think you're actually going to be okay." "I'm still angry," Marcus said. "Good," his mother replied. "Anger is fine. It's what you do with it that matters." UCLA began in September. Marcus and Shelby lived in adjacent dorms. He'd chosen engineering, she'd chosen business, and they navigated the enormous, alienating campus together. They went to different parties. They maintained friendships that didn't include each other. They built separate lives while maintaining a core connection that felt increasingly real and less like performance. In December of their first year, Marcus went home and found his father attempting to walk without assistance. He'd been practicing in physical therapy, and one day, he just wanted to see if he could do it. He got about 8 feet before his knees buckled, but he'd done it. Marcus held his father up, and they stood there together in the living room, breathing hard. "Pool," his father said. "Your pool." "Yeah," Marcus said, "our pool." The irony was that after all the anger, after all the campaign, after all the careful documentation and pressure and planning, his father's legacy had been acknowledged not through any act of justice or karmic correction, but through the simple, practical intervention of wealthy people who discovered a tax angle. It wasn't poetic. It wasn't fair. It wasn't the reckoning that his younger self would have wanted. But it was real. It was happening. And his father was building enough strength to one day walk to Crescent Hill Drive and see it with his own eyes, and that was something. "Good legacy," his father said, still breathing hard from the effort of walking. The email came in March of Marcus's freshman year, forwarded by Shelby with the subject line, "You need to read this." It was from a man named Robert Edwards, who identified himself as a documentary filmmaker. He'd been researching the history of sustainable water systems in residential construction, he explained, and he'd come across Marcus S.R.'s name repeatedly while reviewing 2000s era building permits and design awards. Robert was interested in profiling his work. Apparently, Marcus S.R. had pioneered several techniques that had become standard in the industry, but no one really knew his name. Robert had found Marcus Jr.'s blog post about his father's work, a post Marcus had written months earlier, back when he was still trying to make the neighborhood acknowledge the injustice. Robert had tracked Marcus down through UCLA's directory. He wanted to talk. Marcus called his father immediately. His father's response was characteristically brief. "No." "Dad." "No," his father repeated more firmly. "Done your pool, not their pool." It took Marcus 45 minutes to understand what his father was saying. And when he did, something shifted in his understanding of the entire situation. His father had built the pool for the Richardsons, yes, but he'd built it specifically because the Richardsons' son was taking swimming lessons, and the family wanted him to have a private space to practice. The pool wasn't just a luxury add-on, it was infrastructure created for a specific purpose, with genuine thought toward its use. And then the Richardsons had sold the house, and the pool had been absorbed into the next family's property assessment. And then the next. And then the Martinez family, who'd bought it as a symbol of their status, their arrival in the neighborhood, their permanent placement in the upper middle class. The pool had become unmoored from its purpose. It had become abstracted into real estate value, into the narrative of success and permanence and money. His father didn't want a documentary about the injustice of his erasure. He didn't want to be restored to a narrative he'd never been part of in the first place. He wanted his work to be what it actually was, a thing created with intention, used for its purpose, and then completed. "Tell him no," his father said clearly. The words came out slowly, but they came out with absolute certainty. "Tell him I built a good pool, tell him it still works. Tell him I built 17 good things, tell him that's enough." Marcus stared at the phone. 17 good things. The same number Marcus had been obsessed with for so long. His father had always known, had built 17 pools with intention and care and then moved on to the next project, had never obsessed over whether the world acknowledged what he'd done. He forwarded the email to Robert Edwards with a simple message. "My father is declining the interview. He's built what he built. That's sufficient for him. I hope you can understand." Robert Edwards wrote back, "I'm disappointed, but I understand. If he changes his mind, please let me know. His work is genuinely remarkable." Marcus printed out Robert Edwards's email and showed it to his father. "See," Marcus said, "someone noticed, someone recognized the quality of what you did." His father nodded slowly. "Good, now he can go notice 17 other people, maybe one of them want to talk." And that was it. The closure, the acknowledgement, the small redemption. Not because the neighborhood had finally recognized the injustice, but because someone, somewhere, had noticed the work itself. Not what it meant, or what it symbolized, or what it proved, but what it actually was. The semester continued. Marcus threw himself into his engineering coursework with a purpose that had nothing to do with revenge and everything to do with the desire to build things that lasted. Shelby finished her business courses and developed a genuine passion for social enterprise. Businesses designed to solve problems instead of just generate profit. In the summer after their first year, Shelby suggested they go back to the Martinez house. "I want to show you something," she said. When they arrived, David was out in the backyard with a contractor, someone Marcus didn't recognize. They were having a conversation that looked serious. "What's going on?" Shelby called out. David turned, and for the first time he looked uncomfortable. "Shelby, Marcus, you're back. We have a situation with the pool." "What kind of situation?" "The structural integrity," David said slowly. "According to the contractor, there are significant issues beneath the surface. Apparently, whoever built it 20 years ago was very creative with the design, used experimental techniques that worked beautifully for the first decade and a half, but now the underlying systems are beginning to compromise. It's going to need significant reconstruction, possibly complete rebuilding." Marcus felt something tighten in his chest. "How significant?" Shelby asked. "About $80,000, David said. "Maybe more. Apparently the original contractor didn't use standard materials, used some kind of experimental calcium compound and a water circulation system that was ahead of its time, but isn't really supported by current industry standards. To rebuild it properly, we'd have to essentially start from scratch." The contractor was studying them, trying to understand the family dynamic. "Your husband mentioned the original contractor was named Chen, Marcus Chen SR. I've been in construction for 30 years and I've never seen work like this. It's beautiful, but it's almost impossibly ahead of its time. If he's still alive, he's a genuine artist." "He is," Marcus said quietly. "He is alive." That night, Marcus sat with Shelby, and they processed what this meant. David had built his wealth and status in part on the foundation of a pool that was now revealed to have been architecturally unstable all along. The revolutionary design that had captured the neighborhood's attention was actually a beautiful, doomed experiment. It worked perfectly until it didn't, and then it failed catastrophically. "He was supposed to get paid to fix it," Shelby said quietly. "Your father. When the pool started showing problems, someone was supposed to hire him to repair his own work. That's what should have happened." "But it didn't," Marcus said. Time passed, people forgot who built it, and now that it's failing, nobody knows how to maintain it because the work was so unusual that it's basically unrepairable. My parents are going to have to tell people they're completely rebuilding the pool, Shelby said. They're going to have to explain why this beautiful feature they've bragged about for 20 years is actually unstable, and people are going to question whether they were deceived when they bought the house. People are going to ask why they didn't catch this earlier. That's not justice, Marcus said. No, Shelby agreed. But it's something. It's the cost of his erasure. It's the consequence of people never bothering to learn who did the work or how to maintain it properly. Marcus called his father and told him about the pool. His father listened quietly, and then he said something that took Marcus several minutes to fully understand. Build new pool, his father said. Build with him, show what I know, teach young man to build. Dad. You're water engineer, his father said carefully, working through the difficulty of speech. You build beautiful thing, learn how, learn why. Then teach Martinez man how to maintain, that's legacy, not the pool, the knowledge, the understanding, the knowing that beautiful things need constant care. Marcus wasn't sure if his father was being forgiving or profoundly harsh, if he was suggesting redemption or revenge in the form of education. Maybe it was both. Maybe that was the only kind of justice that actually existed. He told David Martinez what his father had suggested. David's initial response was skeptical, but then he actually visited Marcus SR, saw the physical evidence of his stroke, learned the full story of the neighborhood's casual erasure. And there was something in watching David grapple with his own complicity in that erasure, something that felt closer to actual accountability than any amount of money or media attention ever could have. David hired Marcus SR as a consulting engineer for the pool reconstruction. The cost was substantial, substantially more than David had actually wanted to pay, but also substantially less than actually rebuilding the pool from scratch. And more importantly, David hired Marcus Jr. as an assistant engineer. It was technically a summer job for a college student. In reality, it was Marcus's father teaching his son, not through words, which remained difficult, but through demonstration and presence, exactly what went into creating something that lasted, what went into caring for something, what went into the invisible architecture that supported the visible beauty. On the day they broke ground for the reconstruction, Shelby came to watch. She brought her mother, and her mother brought her friends. The neighborhood, curious about the excavation and the disruption, came to watch. And they learned, for the first time, the actual name of the man who had built the pool that had defined their neighborhood for 20 years. Marcus SR stood at the edge of the construction site, watching his own work being carefully dismantled. He looked smaller than he had before the stroke, and also more substantial, like he'd been compressed into something harder and truer. Legacy, he said, pointing at the hole in the ground where something beautiful would become something else, something maintained, something passed forward. By the time the pool was completed, 8 months later, in the spring of Marcus's sophomore year, something fundamental had shifted in the neighborhood of Crescent Hill Drive. The news about the structural issues had spread. People who had bought homes specifically because those homes had been improved by Marcus Chen S.R.'s work began asking questions about their own properties. Some hired him for repairs and upgrades. Others simply contacted him to confirm that his work was sound, was lasting, was still performing its function after all these years. 17 pools and water features built by Marcus SR in the 2000s, 17 properties that now knew his name. The Martinez reconstruction became something of a neighborhood event. Local news did a human interest story. After 20 years, pool builder gets recognition. It was a soft story, not hard journalism, but it was coverage. Architectural magazines contacted Marcus SR about his experimental techniques. Universities in the area began citing his work in sustainable design courses. And none of it would have happened if Marcus hadn't become so angry. None of it would have happened if the neighborhood hadn't tried to erase his father. None of it would have happened if Shelby hadn't met Marcus and been pushed into consciousness she would have preferred to avoid. On the day the reconstructed pool filled for the first time, David and Janet threw a small ceremony. Just family and Marcus SR and Marcus Jr. and Shelby. The water was a different blue than the original water had been, the same color, technically, but somehow different when you knew the history underneath it. I want to apologize, David said, looking directly at Marcus SR. For 20 years of not knowing your name, for not asking, for not caring about the person behind the work, for taking you for granted. Marcus SR nodded slowly. Good man, learn, show respect, that's what matter. Later, alone by the pool with Shelby, Marcus tried to process the strangeness of this resolution. I wanted justice, he said quietly. I wanted the neighborhood to acknowledge what they'd done, and they did, but only because something broke, only because they were forced to pay attention. That is how justice works sometimes, Shelby said. Not perfectly, not even fairly, but eventually the truth comes out. Because the foundation was unstable, Marcus said. Because my father's experimental work only lasted so long. If he'd built a standard pool, none of this would have happened. They would have kept his name a secret forever. Or, Shelby suggested carefully, he'd have built something that lasted and someone would have eventually noticed. Someone like Robert Edwards, the documentary filmmaker. Someone would have eventually recognized the quality. That's not the same as the neighborhood recognizing it. No, Shelby agreed. But maybe it's better. Maybe the neighborhood doesn't get to decide whether his work was valuable. Maybe the work decides that for itself. Marcus considered this. He thought about the 17 properties. He thought about his father in his physical therapy sessions, slowly regaining mobility and dignity. He thought about the ways that justice didn't look like what he'd expected, but that it was still justice of a kind. I'm sorry, he said to Shelby, for using you. I forgive you, Shelby said immediately. But more importantly, I want you to forgive yourself. You were a kid who was angry about something that was genuinely unjust. You pushed back. Some of that pushing back was manipulative and wrong, but it also brought about change. Both things are true simultaneously. Marcus pulled her close, and they sat at the edge of his father's rebuilt pool, watching the water settle into its permanent blue. In 2 months, Marcus would return to UCLA. He'd finish his engineering degree and then go to graduate school for sustainable systems design. He'd work, eventually, on water systems in developing countries, infrastructure that lasted, that could be maintained by local experts, that was built with intention toward permanence and care. He'd stay with Shelby. They'd graduate together. They'd navigate the complications of partnership that came with their complicated history. And they'd both understand always that the worst and best parts of their relationship had emerged from the same moment, from a girl's casual dismissal of a boy she didn't think belonged, and that boy's decision to make her understand. But in this moment, they were just two 18-year-olds sitting at the edge of a pool that had been built with intention, destroyed and rebuilt, and now stood as a monument not to injustice, but to what happened when people were forced to see beyond their own assumptions. Your father should be proud, Shelby said. He's too busy being practical about the next project, Marcus replied. But yeah, I think he is. And in the backyard of the Martinez house on Crescent Hill Drive, the pool that Marcus SR had built 20 years ago, the pool that had triggered a chain of events leading to revelation, reckoning, and something approaching grace, settled into its new permanence, waiting to be maintained, waiting to be cared for, waiting to be understood.